Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Illinois Learns to Hunt, Goose Hunting 102. For those of you who, if this is your first webinar with us, we're going to go through some reminders for those who have joined us before. Just so you know that your microphones and webcams are disabled tonight, so you don't have to worry about answering any questions or anything like that. Just sit back and relax and enjoy the presentation as we work through it. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, there is a Q&A button where you can submit any questions. You can also do that anonymously, so that if there's any, not that there's that, of course, the old saying, there's never a dumb question, but if you're nervous, you just put that in anonymously and we'll answer that. So either the presenter will answer that live or one of us will answer it in the chat through the Q&A window. We also will have time at the end. If you think of any questions as we're moving through, or if something pops in your head at the very end, we'll have a couple minutes after this is over to answer any hunting questions you may have for Illinois. There is a chat. You can use that as well to make a statement or answer someone else's question or something like that if you would like. But again, if you have a question, just throw that in the Q&A one. It's easier for us to see it pop up right away. And we will be sending out an email after this is over. So a lot of people want a copy of the PowerPoint that we're going to be working off of here. So you'll get a copy of that. You'll also get a recording that will take you to a YouTube link that will have a recording of this. And you'll have some handouts that give you like a checklist and things that you need to remember as a new waterfowl hunter or a continuing waterfowl hunter. And then we will also be sending you a survey. And this is important to us. One, it provides feedback, so that way we know how our webinars are going and if we need to change the scope of the information we're given, or if there's any ideas for Goose 103, if we haven't covered something and you're still interested in it. It also helps us kind of show the data to the DNR and to the, we're out of the University of Illinois. We're not working for the DNR, but we can use this data to help with our reports that we give to the university and to DNR to be like, hey, this is where we're lacking at and this is where we need to move forward to get these new hunters out in the field. So we really appreciate it. It's only a couple minute long survey. So again, when you get that, please just take a couple minutes, fill that out, and that helps us with our robust data set that we can have to show the DNR. So just real quick, a course outline for tonight. We're gonna have, oh, pardon me. We're gonna have how hunters are conservationists. This is how we start off all of our presentations, talking about hunters and your conservation dollars spent in America. Then we're going to go over the ecology and all the different types of species of goose you're going to see in Illinois. Then we'll talk about the habitat and then some land access that we talk about in each of our webinars and how to find some land access in the state. Then we're going to go over the firearms and ammunition selection for goose hunting. Then we'll talk about equipment and the extensive equipment that you need for waterfowl hunting, going over the optional equipment versus the required equipment. And then we're gonna get into some fun stuff, talking about decoy strategies and showing you different layouts and different selections you can do for that. And then talk about a typical day of goose hunting to give you an idea of what that entails. And again, like I said, at the end, we'll have some time for a question and answering session at the very end. So tonight, presenters with us, as usual, we got Dan. Dan, we'd like to say hi real fast so everybody knows what you sound like.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. And I just wanted to do a quick apology up front. I was the one who kind of sent out that link earlier, and I just want to apologize for sending out the incorrect link the first time. And a few of you graciously called and kind of let us know ahead of time that link was not working. So thank you for that, so we could get that sorted and fixed right away. So thanks, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Awesome. Okay, then we also have Adam with us. Adam, we want to say hi.
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for joining us and hope you guys enjoy our webinar tonight.
Very good. And that is me right there, Jason, and welcome everybody. A pleasure to have you all here with us today. And we also have with us Curtis. Curtis, I'd like to say hi.
Good evening, everybody.
Hello. All right, and Curtis is actually going to start us off. So Curtis, you want to tell us a little bit how hunters are conservationists?
Yeah, so thanks, Jason. So in North America, hunters are basically the driving force that drives wildlife conservation. A lot of people think, like a lot of things, roads, infrastructure, it might be general tax dollars that go to that, but that's really not the case. Hunters have multiple different ways that they fund conservation. One of them is the Pittman-Robertson Act, which is an excise tax on firearms and ammunition and sporting goods that goes directly back to conservation. So it's a 10 to 11% excise tax that happens on the manufactured level. So it's not like if you go into a gun shop and buy a store, there's not going to be 10 to 11% tax added. That was done previously at the manufacturer level, but yeah, in doing so, this generates an enormous amount of revenue that goes directly back to the states to fund wildlife management and wildlife conservation, and also, provide opportunities at shooting ranges and education to get involved with those things. So really an awesome system. I'm partial, but if you ask me, it's the most successful system for wildlife conservation that the world has ever known. And I mentioned there's multiple different ways. So this Pittman-Robertson Act is one way. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that continues right on with the permits that hunters have to buy. So you'll have to buy a number of different permits that we'll get into later in the presentation to waterfowl hunt. One of those is the duck stamp. And, this is a really cool program. It's one of the most efficient fundraising efforts in any venue in existence. 98% of every dollar goes directly back to the habitat, protect, or to buy and set aside critical waterfowl habitat. So duck stamp program is awesome. It's such a good program and has benefited so many places that a lot of people who don't even have to buy duck stamps, just birders or collectors, will purchase these just to donate money to such a good cause. So, and of course we call it a duck stamp, but really it's a migratory bird hunting stamp. So anybody that's hunting geese is going to need one of these. Another thing you need to remember, these are really awesome works of art. They represent some of the best wildlife artists in the entire world. And it's a really big deal when an artist gets selected to have their work featured. So not only is it a great way to put money back into habitat, but you're really buying a piece of American art, and they're collectible. Some people have them, they save them up for their whole life on a board, and it turns into a really unique part of like Americana collectible that also put a lot of money into conservation. So a real win-win. And you can get these at your post office, any of your licensed vendors, or they're also available online. So really good program, really good art. Make good Christmas presents. We're after Christmas, but remember it for next year. Go on to the next slide here. Get into a little bit of goose ecology. So when you're out goose hunting, it's not important that you are able to recognize or to identify all of these different subspecies. This might look intimidating. There's seven different subspecies of Canada goose and 4 of cackling. But when you're out hunting, all you got to know is that it's one of these 2 types of geese with the black head and neck and the white face patch. They're all going to fit together in the same limits, but it is kind of cool to know that there is quite a diversity here. And the first thing we should notice is that giant Canada geese, which is that subspecies is highlighted there, that's going to be our resident subspecies. So the geese that you see all year, maybe they chase you from your car to your office in the springtime, or they chase you at the golf course or whatever they do. Those are all the giant Canada geese. That's the biggest subspecies, as the name would imply. Later in the year, so this time of year, now we're in winter, we still, since it's been a relatively mild year, still got the giant Canada geese around. They tend to stick around year round, but this time of year we've got a mix. We could also have the migratory populations from the interior, and even some of the further western subspecies, and then also cackling geese. If it's been kind of a mild year, so there's not a ton around, but in a normal year, this is about the time, late December, January, when start seeing some cacklers around too. So just good to know, a big diversity out there. They all nest in different places. They look a little bit different. They sound a little bit different. Pretty hard to ID out in the field, but primarily just by geographic area, you can pretty much tell what you're going to encounter that in that particular place at that time of year. So move on to the next slide here. In Illinois, we got the two populations, and these two populations actually drive management activities. So our resident giant Canada geese, you know, this population is increasing, and not just in Illinois. This is across the entire country, and significant nuisance issues can happen with these geese. But because this population is increasing, the Illinois DNR wants to increase hunting opportunity on these geese, and that's why you generally see a higher bag limit with the earlier season, because that's before any migration has happened. They know that season is targeting the resident specifically. Then later in the season, that you know, the later portion of the season, that bag limit goes down, and that's because the migratory population is really stable. You know, could be marginally decreasing in some areas, but for the most part stable. So they really don't want to drive that population up or down. So they, you know, pretty much keep that limit at 2. But just kind of neat how with the two different populations and their ecology and what time of year they're in Illinois, wildlife managers can adjust their seasons to sort of, you know, get desired results. So that's pretty cool. And it's a good example of how hunting is definitely still not only generates money for conservation efforts, but is in and of itself an excellent wildlife management tool. And one of those reasons is to mitigate nuisance issues. So I don't know about you all, but I can hear this picture right here. These geese look very ornery and very angry, and I think they've been watching a little bit too much Jurassic Park. So, you know, Canada geese can definitely cause some nuisance issues. We know they can be aggressive, obviously. A lot of you, maybe you've experienced it, or you've at least seen the videos of people being chased, especially in the springtime when they're guarding a nest or starting to think along those lines. And in Illinois, especially this year, a mild year, this resident population of giant Canada geese might be there year round and really never leave. If they do leave, they tend to come back to the same area every year to nest, and they can cause significant damage grazing and, you know, eating off all the vegetation, but then also a large amount of excrement too. So certainly can be a nuisance issue. A lot of fun to hunt, but that's why we get generally one more goose in the bag limit in that early season. So go on to the next slide. So now here we go. We got two different kinds of geese with the white patch on their face there. So these, again, same limit when you're out hunting in the bag, but it's nice to know what you get. And every once in a while in Illinois, you may encounter a cackling goose. And so these two, Canada goose and cackling goose, are split. And I should mention it's the American Ornithological Union that basically decides what bird species go where. This has changed multiple times in my life. I'm sure it'll change multiple times going forward, especially as, you know, things like looking at genetics gets more and more popular. But for right now, we've got the 4 subspecies of cackling goose. The best way really to tell them apart is that bill. If you notice on the cackling goose, it's a real small triangular shaped bill that is roughly, if you take the distance from where the bill starts to the eye and from where the bill starts to the tip of the bill, it's roughly the same measurement. So a real short triangular bill. And then the Canada goose has that much more elongated bill that's generally going to be a greater distance than the distance from the front of the face to the eye. So And generally, there's going to be a size difference too. Cackling geese are smaller on average, but there is a little bit of overlap there. So the subspecies of cackling goose known as the tavernais, they're on the bigger side, so they can overlap with some of the smaller subspecies of Canada goose. Hearing them is also a good way to tell them apart. Other than that bill, the cackling geese definitely have a higher pitched call that's going to be more reminiscent of a white-fronted goose. And actually, I think if we've got the calls ready, we might be able to hear a cackling goose.
Yep, and this is just a quick headphone warning. I'll give you guys a few seconds to maybe turn your volume down just a hair because it is a high-pitched call. So this is the cackling goose.
Excellent. And yeah, we should go ahead and back that up with the Canada goose call, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with, but just hearing it right after that cackling goose can help you sort of see the differences. So we'll cue that one up for you. Oh, beautiful. Just music to your ears hearing these geese play their song. So, yeah, you'll definitely notice the Canada goose. It's a larger, more robust honk. And the cackling goose is a more high-pitched, more screamy call. So a lot of times if you're out hunting, you're just seeing flocks of Canada geese. That's the first thing that you might notice is one of them starts calling. It sounds different. You're like, oh, it almost sounds like a snow or a white front, but they look like a Canada goose. Well, that's your flock of cacklers. So definitely cool to know. Move on here to the next slide, and we got some more geese that come through. And right now, I might have a chance to see some greater white-fronted geese. A lot of times people are going to call these speckle bellies or specks. The reason is obvious. You can see in that flying picture up there in the top, that adult there's got a ton of black speckling on its breast. The younger two, those are first year birds. They haven't developed those speckles yet, but they'll get them in time if they make it for a second flight. So definitely white fronts or specks are not as common as Canada geese in Illinois, nowhere near as common as Canada geese. And seasonally, they're not as common as snow geese either, but they can definitely be found. And if you hit the migration just right where they're coming through, you have a chance of seeing good numbers of these. But generally, this is going to be something that the waterfowl hunter maybe gets a chance at just a couple times a year. So definitely on the less common side, but one thing you'll notice that really pops out at you, they're called white-fronted geese. And if you're looking at them standing, it may not be obvious, but when you look at them flying, you can see it's pretty obvious that they got that white frontal face shield that stands out against their pinkish orange bill. And then their bright orange feet really stand out too. So, really easy to tell these apart from Canada's in the field, even though they're both dark geese. Those bright orange feet as opposed to the black feet of a Canada geese certainly pop out. These guys nest up in the Arctic, winter down in the Gulf. They've got a pretty reliable migration, whereas the Canada geese, they like to stay as far north as possible. So on a mild year like this, there's a whole bunch of geese that may never get down to you. But the white fronts, they tend to migrate a little bit better even in mild years. So we usually do get to see them come through. But whether or not they stick around long enough for you to get a crack at them, that's another story. But I think we've also got a sounds. We got some honks from some white fronts that we can play you. So we'll go ahead and cue those up.
And this is definitely a headphone warning. This one is a very high-pitched vocalization.
What a beautiful call. And one thing I should mention about specs, they're known as being very easy to call. So if you do hear them, if you're out there goose hunting, even if you only got a Canada goose call, they do sell spec calls. But if you just try to make a call that imitates them a little bit, a lot of times they're gonna turn and give you a look. So definitely respond well to calling. Now we've got the light geese. These guys, they've been a little bit more problematic across the landscape, which we'll get to in the next couple slides here. But first thing we want to know is snow geese. So blue geese, people say snows and blues. It's all the same species. It's all snow geese, but blue geese are a color phase. So they can be a lot of differentiation between a lot of different varieties of blue geese, basically. So you can see a lot of different forms out there, but they're all snow geese. These guys, you can see them in very, very big flocks, and this can make them hard to hunt. But sometimes you're seeing flocks not only in the thousands, but you can see flocks in the tens of thousands. And you can see people, if you look at YouTube videos or something of snow goose hunters, they'll be out in a field and have these flocks of 1,000 birds funneling down on them like a tornado. And wow, it's just it's quite a spectacle. So pretty cool thing. But the unfortunate thing with snow geese is they've really taken advantage of the really good food that we provide them across their whole migration route in the form of grain crops, and their population has really exploded in the age of conservation here. So, which sounds great from a hunting standpoint, but what we got to remember is these birds nest in the Arctic and in the tundra regions of Hudson Bay. And in Hudson Bay specifically, that's where this picture here on the lower portion come from. A really high population where they've got low mortality, basically, because they're tough to hunt. They fly in such big flocks. They come through late in the year. Pretty low hunting mortality, but they've got a ton of food in the grain fields. Come back to the tundra each year, more and more birds. Eventually, it can't support it. Snow geese kind of eat, they can grub, they call it grubbing. So they not only might eat the entire green shoot, but they can flip it over and eat the roots as well. So basically you see this tundra ecosystem that's completely denuded and is no longer of use to not only just snow geese, but other birds and caribou and other animals that depend on that habitat as well. So that led basically wildlife managers to start what's known as this conservation order, or the light goose order on snow geese. And that's that extended snow goose season in the spring that's got the special regulations and no bag limits. And that's just an attempt to sort of increase hunting mortality to mitigate this destruction on the breeding land. So unfortunate thing, but another good example at how hunting is used as a modern day wildlife management tool. So move on to the next slide here. And so we also might encounter Ross's goose occasionally here in Illinois. So they're going to be uncommon. And generally, if you're looking out at a field, and there's a couple thousand snows in that group, if you look on the fringes, you can usually pick out a Ross's or two. So they are around, but much less common than the snow geese. And generally they'll be mixed in the same flocks. They're a little bit bigger than a nice sized mallard. So maybe about 2/3 the size of a snow goose. But the best way to really tell them apart is, again, gonna come down to that bill. See that really short triangular pink bill? That's diagnostic. And without that grin patch, I told you snow geese like to feed in a way that's called grubbing. So this big grin patch there is basically like a garden digging tool for them, that they can grip plants down at the bottom and sort of get at those nice yummy tubers and rhizomes and roots that they like to eat. So that bill's going to be the best way to tell them apart. Their limits, again, just like with the Canada and the cacklers, they're combined, so you don't have to tell these apart when you're hunting before you pull the trigger. But you know, it's nice to know if you do wind up with a Ross's in your bag and know that you got something special. That might be the bird that heads to the taxidermist. So pretty cool. And I believe we got it's a hard time finding vocalization for Ross's geese, but they sound a lot like snow geese. But I think we do get a snow goose sound that we can play for you. So we'll go ahead and cue that up here.
Yes, and I'll play two different vocalizations. This first one is going to be one of these. Curtis mentioned, you know, sometimes they flock in the several thousand birds. And so that's what this first kind of playback is going to sound like, is just 1,000 different, you know, snow geese all kind of calling at once. And then now here's an isolated kind of individual call.
Sounds lonely there all by himself, but yeah, the snow goose is kind of known as having that one syllable call, but you very rarely get to hear it like that because they travel around in such big flocks. But they definitely have that distinctive sound in a big flock. And if you are around them for any considerable period of time, we were talking about this just a little bit ago, that sound will stick with you. So even after you leave the marsh, you'll be, you know, sitting at home watching football or something, and you'll think you're hearing geese in the background. So it's kind of a neat phenomenon. But yeah, that's our light geese. Keep an eye out for those Ross's geese. You might see one. This is one you're probably not going to see in Illinois. It is possible, and if you do encounter them, they are legal to take. Because it is a game species where they reside, but the brant is really a marine goose. They feed on a lot of marine aquatic vegetation, and they stick to those marine habitats. So it's not impossible. There have been brant harvested in Illinois in the history of the world, but you're not likely to see them. That would certainly be the much more rare than any of the other geese we talked about here today. So good to know that they're out there. You'll see them listed in the limits because they are, like I said, a legal game bird. But yeah, I'd be surprised if, you know, we're not talking about multiples being shot every year. I'd be surprised if there's even a single bird shot in any given year. So pretty uncommon. We'll go on to the next slide here. Waterfowl banding program. So this is pretty cool. And this is one thing that's really cool about waterfowl hunting. You go out goose hunting, you've got a chance of getting a band, which, yeah, it's just a little piece of metal. But when you get that band recovery, you're basically playing the part as the citizen scientist. So when you call in or report that band, you can do it online. First off, they'll send you a little certificate that tells you what year and where that bird was banded, which is pretty cool because sometimes it might have been banded a long time ago, and sometimes it might have been banded a long ways from you. So that's pretty cool information to know. But even on top of that, the biologists who are collecting that data can use that location data to learn about that population of geese, where they migrate, or of course they put these on ducks too. So if it's a duck, the same thing. They learn about the waterfowl movements, but they can also use band recoveries in a given year as a metric to basically look at the entire duck and goose population as a simple ratio. We see over here that about 200,000 ducks and 150,000 geese and swans are banded per year. So if 60,000 duck bands get called in a given year, they can make kind of a ratio to determine what they think the total population might be. So Is it a perfect number? No, but like anything in judging the numbers of wildlife that are difficult to count, it's a metric that certainly helps. So it's cool that you get to play that part as the citizen scientist and help find out more about waterfowl. You also get to keep the band, which is generally a cool little trophy that waterfowl hunters like to put on your lanyard, or maybe you wind up getting that goose or duck mounted and put that band on there. But it's kind of like with the deer hunting crowd, they get a trophy buck. That's kind of what a banded bird is for waterfowl hunters. So pretty cool in more ways than one. Be on the lookout. Occasionally, you'll even see rewards bands. And it's much rarer than the normal bands, but occasionally there will be bands out there that offer up a reward in terms of cash money, and they do that to periodically check what the return rate on bands are. The idea being that if they have $100 reward band, pretty much everybody that gets that is going to report it, and they can use those numbers to check, give out progressively less, $75, $50, $25 rewards bands, and kind of look at how those return rates differ to make a judge on how many they're getting of the free bands back. So pretty cool stuff, science stuff, and a little bit of trophy for the goose hunter here. So what's not to love?
Hey, Curtis. Just something else that just popped in my head as I'm looking at this, just thinking about as hunters, as a byproduct of hunter numbers declining, research like this may be harder to produce because they won't have as many hunters out shooting wild waterfowl as much. So it's just something else. It's just another byproduct of the declining hunting numbers in North America that you got to worry about, that there's this big effect that happens if that does happen.
Certainly, yeah, that's a good point. And that's one thing, that people banned all kinds of birds, but it's amongst the bird banding circles, it's widely known that any bird that's harvested is much better to ban because you can just put these little metal bands on them that don't have to be read from the field. But then when you're talking about songbirds, now you're talking about different color bands, and you got to report them in a certain way, and it's complicated. So yeah, definitely a good point there. Hunters were really the first citizen scientists, so still continued to this day. Let's talk about some of the different habitats where you might find geese or be hunting geese. And in the Midwest, it's no secret, the number one go-to is probably going to be your crop fields. And early in the year, pasture can be really, really productive as well. But this is what the geese are looking for. If they're the migrating population, obviously they need to keep their fat and protein reserves and carbohydrates up high so they can fuel their migration. If it's the giant resident population, well, they just need to eat a lot so they're able to stay warm and stay comfortable throughout the cold winter. So either which way, they're going to be looking for food, and at when it's seasonally available in the late fall and through the winter, grain crops can be an excellent spot. And it's where a lot of people that are goose hunters are probably, keeping their eye on right now, watching the field, seeing if any geese are using it. And, if they see them, then they're trying to get permission. But if you're scouting and looking for geese to potentially hunt, start with your crop fields near the roosting areas. So if there's a big refuge, a big pond, or a river where the geese are roosting at night, look at the crop fields near there. That's going to be some of the first places that they check out for waste grain. And don't look past green pastures, especially in that early season for the giant Canadas, especially if you got a pasture field with some green alfalfa, clover, nice little, pond, water source in the middle for the cattle. Man, those can be awesome places for some early season goose hunts. So check that stuff out. But if you don't have that available, we also got open water habitats, which would be the next slide here. And this is another way that you can hunt geese. Now you're talking about floating decoys and potentially needing either waders or a boat or a dog to get your game. But geese, just like ducks, will definitely use, that's where they feel the safest, on open water. So if they're loafing to digest their food, or if they're sitting roosting for the night, they want to do that on a big piece of open water. So river, lake, slough, anything like that can be used for this. And a lot of times this might be the easiest place to find them, because there might only be 1 or 2 roosting areas and a lot of feeding areas. So if you can start there and then sort of follow the geese when they leave, that can be a great way to try to find out where they're feeding and try to find a spot where you can hunt them. The next slide here is going to be emergent wetlands. These are great for all waterfowl. They can be loafing and feeding areas, a combination of both. So always don't overlook these. You know, duck hunters will get opportunities at geese throughout the year, but when the migrating flocks are coming through, sometimes there can be a lot of geese on these emergent wetlands too. So definitely keep your eye on those. You know, a good thing about these, abundance of food year round, a lot of different types of food that can be persistent. And generally you can find a place to hide pretty good in all that emergent vegetation that's coming out of the water. So keep an eye on those. Lots of good different places you can watch for geese that you can hunt. And this is the time of year to do it. Go on to the next slide here, land access. I'm going to turn it over to Jason.
Thanks a lot, Curtis. Great job so far. All right, so we're going to talk about some land access here. So we have a couple different types of land you can go hunt in Illinois. And so there's hunting preserves, so there's outfitters. And I know there's a lot of outfitters are common with snow geese because they have thousands of decoys they can put out. And that's something that a normal person may not have. So if you want to go look at hunting some snow geese, you can go to an outfitter to do that. That's probably a real common one here. They also have a lot of hunting clubs and things around on the different rivers that can be a little pricey to join, but some you might be able to find and go join them and have some spots. So hunting preserves. And then we have some public land, and that's broken into federal, state, county, and the Irap program, which I'll go over in a second. And then we have some private land. So if you have land or can ask permission to get on some private land, you can go hunt there. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the public land, because that's the most confusing for a lot of the new hunters and current hunters. So there's good, I might go back to this real fast. No. Okay, so the good thing, I'm going to be holding off a cough here throughout this. I apologize if I let one loose. But the good thing about Illinois is there's a couple options for public land, but it's also slightly confusing. So the first option is going to be the Illinois DNR land access drawing. So these were canceled last year due to COVID, mainly because of the photograph we have here. So it's usually almost like a tailgate situation. You can go there and they do these live drawings. You have to be present to win, and people will come from all over these different drawings that they have to get access. So for these, you can get a blind that is yours for 1 to 3 years. So it depends on which blind you draw, but the range is 1 to 3 years. And some you have to build your own, others are already constructed for you. And pardon me. And if you aren't using it, and if you go to that site and that hunter is not using it, you can use it if the hunter is not using it. There's also walk-in access. So there are, like I've done that over at Kickapoo in central Illinois here, gone goose hunting over Kickapoo. They have stakes out along the different water bodies over there, and you can hunt within 10 yards of that stake. And if you're not having luck at one stake, you can go to another stake. That involves going and checking in at the office and kind of first come, first serve. You sign up to what stake you're going to, and then you go and hunt that stake for the day. And then there's also standby permits. So there's going to be a lottery, the public duck and goose lottery that they have. If people don't come for those, you can be a standby person for those and get that for that day. So they also canceled those this year because of COVID. So at least of last year. So we'll see what they do next year with the vaccine coming out. Dan, is there anything that I could clarify with that? Because I know it's a lot.
No, I think you said it well. The biggest thing to remember is there's two main lotteries, and so Jason did a good job describing this kind of overall waterfowl blind drawing. That's kind of an in-person thing, and it's I like to call it a build a blind. But the biggest challenge with those is, again, if you're kind of new to Illinois or new to hunting, there are very specific kind of regulations and procedures in place for how that blind is constructed and how it's kind of manufactured and how it's staked into the ground and these different things. But the next option, and I think it's on the next slide, is the public duck and goose lottery. And so that lottery you actually put in for ahead of time. And so you'll pick what site you want, and then you'll get, if you get drawn, you will get a blind for a specific day. And the nice thing about this specific lottery application is that when you get drawn for a blind, it's very common that you get to bring other people. So a lot of the places I hunt, like Clinton Lake, I've put in for that blind before at the Salt Creek. You can bring yourself plus 3 other hunters. And so if you get, a group of, 4 or 5 friends or colleagues or, family together, and you all put in for different dates at different locations, then you're starting to expand your kind of waterfowl hunting opportunity. If you just kind of focus on yourself and just focus on kind of this, the one blind that you draw, chances are you're only going to get to hunt, 1 day per year out of that blind. And so kind of working with some of your friends or trying to get some buddies together or family can really help bolster that, so you can have more opportunities to hunt. Because the biggest challenge with these applications is, you can see when the application deadlines are. So they're in August and September, and that's, way before we have an idea of what the winter's really going to look like. And so sometimes you may draw a blind that, it happens to be 70 degrees that day. And if that's your only blind for that year, that can be really frustrating. And so again, just kind of working those networks is a great way to do it. But like, we'll kind of end this land access section in a few minutes. Private land is going to be one of your biggest go-to for goose hunting.
Awesome. And again, Dan, the standby is for this lottery, right? For anyone who wants to do the standby, they come to these.
Correct. So let's say, for instance, and not every DNR site has standby options. So some of the places you will show up that day, put your name on the list, and if there are people who drew a blind but they don't show up that day to hunt by a certain time, then they will start drawing another lottery from those standby permits who drove there that morning. And that's real challenging for a lot of people, just because a lot of times that deadline may be, 5:30, 5:45 in the morning, sometimes earlier depending on the site. And so if you're coming from an hour or two away just to be a standby hunter, that can be a little challenging. So if you are going to try to do the standby route, particularly next year when they likely open that option back up, I recommend focusing on weekdays. If your work situation and family situation allows that, because typically there's going to be a few people who just don't show up for that hunt. And weekdays you typically see a lower number of people who kind of can make the drive for standby. So standby is an option next year probably. And if you do so, try to focus on either weekdays or days that the weather isn't just nearly as advantageous for waterfowl. And that's a good way to ensure that you have kind of increased odds during that standby period.
Yeah, because this lottery it's a random day they give you. Like, you don't pick a weekend day or a weekday day. So there's a chance during a weekday that someone won the lottery, but they don't have that schedule to where they could go and use that blind that day, right, Dan?
Correct. So when you put in for your lottery application, you'll pick a blind, and then it'll give you a choice. I think you get 5 or 10 days for each blind. And you'll just kind of have to, again, you're doing this months in advance. And so that can be a little challenging if you're not really sure what your schedule looks like, come December or January.
Got it. I started waterfowl. I'll be all discretion. I started waterfowl hunting last year with Dan, so that's why I make sure I'm right with Dan. Thanks, buddy. All right. So another way to look for those walk-in sites would be using the Hunt Planner at huntillinois.org. And for this, you can select a site near you or a specific site if you know the name of the site that you're interested in hunting, or go by county or region, see here, and then you can work your way down. So then when it says, what do you want to hunt? You can select waterfowl, goose, or duck, and that will take you to the sites that offer that. And that is a huge step up this past year when they came out with this website, because prior to this, it was just A to Z list of the sites, and you had to click through each one and look at the hunter fact sheet and see what the regulations were for each site to see if they had waterfowl seasons or not. This puts it all in the database and allows you to sort it and have that pop up right for you there. So I highly suggest everybody going and checking out huntillinois.org and going through. There's a tutorial video that shows you how to use the website. It's only about 7 minutes long, and that will tell you everything you need to know about this website and how to use these different tools that the DNR is trying to help everybody out, figure out where to go through that website. Another resource is looking at how plentiful a site could be for waterfowl hunting. It's not on this page, but if you keep scrolling down, they have waterfowl numbers. This is a snip of the first page of this document. So it's a public land hunting report, and it shows the amount of each species that was taken the previous year, and how many were gotten, and how large of an area it is, and how often it's hunted. So you can see how pressured a site is, and you can kind of use that to help figure out what site's worth your time going and scoping out and trying to go hunt there. So again, that's available at the DNR website. So public land hunting report. So that's a good resource to have. And then there's also the Irap program, and this is where private landowners allow the public to come hunt on their land. And with that program, they team up with the DNR, and they either get a management plan and possibly some funds to do a management project on their land. And pardon me, with that, they open up their land for use. And this is another lottery, unfortunately, but it's not as cutthroat as some of the other lotteries are, because a lot of people don't even know that this is around yet. It has been around for several years, but still people, it's a new thing, so they don't use it as quickly as other people might. So you can apply for this, and if you're a first-time hunter or if you're a youth hunter, first-time hunter meaning that you haven't hunted that species in 5 years, then you are more likely to win this lottery than another hunter would be. Then we covered the lottery already. And again, private land, like Dan said, this is 96% of Illinois is private land, so that's the majority of it, clearly. And it can be difficult to get permission to hunt on private land, but if you go and are professional and ask the landowner, you may find access, especially for goose hunting in a cut field. Not much of farming is going on right now, so you might have better luck doing this than maybe going deer hunting or turkey hunting there. So you can utilize Plat Map Information, which is taxation information, tells you who the landowners are. You can find this information online or at the courthouse. They also have some new mobile apps that are out now, like OnX Maps and other map apps like that. Those you have to pay for, but those have the overlay of the tax information over a Google Map layer, and it's very easy to see who owns the map, or who owns the land. And this is helpful. Imagine just driving around and seeing a bunch of geese laying in a field. You can see who owns that field or adjacent fields, and the next day try to get out there to hunt them if you can contact that landowner. So something to keep in mind. A lot of land. Oh, someone want to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in real quick and kind of say my experience and a few tips to get private land access, particularly for waterfowl and geese specifically. And Jason kind of brought this point up a little bit, that, most of the time you're going to see, these big flocks of geese just fielding in either a cut cornfield or maybe an old soybean field. But what I really like to focus on when I'm trying to make contact with a landowner is I try to find either a farmer that's using some type of cover crop, maybe it's winter wheat or some kind of alfalfa or something that kind of carries through the fall a little bit more. Those farmers are going to be really concerned about damage to their crop. And so very, very often, if you see, geese hitting a field that looks like it was planted in winter wheat or something like that, that is a very good opportunity to approach that landowner or that farmer and say, hey, look, I'm willing to come out here and remove some of these geese, and that will likely increase your farming yield. And they will be very, very, very receptive to that. So that's kind of what I try to look for. And another thing, when you first, make contact with the landowner, very commonly what I have found, particularly if you make a phone call first, which I kind of recommend now that, we're still in the COVID pandemic, is making a phone call first. 95% of the time I have made a phone call to a farmer or to a landowner, they're typically going to pass your contact information to the wife. So just kind of keep that in mind, that very often you're going to be trying to discuss this with the wife, who kind of typically manages that side of the farm. So just kind of keep that in mind. I always try to be as presentable as you can. I even have some friends who have gone the next step and basically created a hunter's resume for themselves that says, here are some people that I've previously hunted with, some other landowners you can call for references. Here's my experience, and blah, blah, blah. And the biggest thing you're trying to do as a hunter when you approach a landowner is set yourself apart from all the other hunters that have knocked on your door. Particularly with geese, if you're driving down the interstate and you see, a big flock of geese in a field and you happen to go try to contact that landowner, chances are you're not the first hunter to do that, and you're probably not going to be the last. So a lot of times it's just, what can you do to improve your chances and just kind of distinguish yourself from others. And sometimes that's, being as prepared as possible with documents, but also it's kind of offering some of your time or your services. So sometimes you might just say, hey, can I help out on the farm for a weekend for goose hunting permission? And that type of thing goes a long way with a landowner.
Thank you, Dan. And then also another thing you can try is this Lan Access Card, which is available at the DNR website as well. It kind of helps you take away the liability. It makes it, again, more professional, your agreement with them. It's a small contract, basically just giving them your information and agreeing that you do have permission to hunt on their land. And it's something to keep in mind that I know a lot of deer hunters are doing these land leases where they pay for access to the land, but the law as of right now is if you exchange money with the landowner, then they are now liable for your safety. If they don't exchange money, then they are not liable. So that's something to keep in mind. If someone's worried about liability issues, if you do it for free, then they don't have any liability. And lastly, don't worry about this too much if you're going out into a field, but just something we like to keep in mind, that you need to know your boundaries as you're hunting. And if you're getting close to them, you need to know where you're at, be it on public land or on private land. And we'd like to draw attention to people who may be new to hunting that there is a law in Illinois that's called the Purple Paint Law, and might not be called that, but basically the purple paint is as good as a no trespassing sign or a no hunting sign. So if you come to a line of trees and there's purple paint, and that means that you're hopefully on the right side, but you shouldn't cross that line. So just a heads up there if you aren't familiar with that law. All right, I'm going to pass this off to Adam, who's going to talk about finding. Oh,
no, Dan.
Dan.
That's okay.
Dan to do. Adam does a lot of regs a lot of the time, but okay, we're going to Dan to talk about site-specific regs.
Perfect. So yeah, like Jason mentioned, we're now going to dive into regulations a little bit. And first, we're going to start off just kind of overviewing how you can find these site-specific regulations. So Illinois DNR has constructed these hunter fact sheets that basically tell you everything you can do at a specific site, where you can do it, when you can do it, how you can do it, and kind of what the methods are necessary to be able to do it. So some of these sites will have windshield identification cards. So those are completely free, but you just go into the Illinois DNR's website and go to the windshield card. I find it easier to just Google Illinois DNR windshield card and it pops up rather than trying to navigate through their site. But the windshield cards, you'll just kind of select the specific location you're hunting and what species you're targeting. And then at the end of the year, you will need to go back and report how often you hunted and what you harvested. And so that's just another metric that DNR uses to gauge, hunter efficiency and harvest numbers. And so that's very important. But what's more common specifically for waterfowl is kind of the sign in, sign out. So very commonly at the site office, they'll have a place for you to just kind of sign in your name, tell them where you'll be hunting. And then upon, leaving that site at the end of the day, you'll come back, sign out and record your harvest and how many hours you hunted. So it's pretty straightforward. Now you may recognize here at the bottom, it says non-toxic shot may be required. For waterfowl, non-toxic is required 100% of the time. And we'll get into that a little bit right now. So we'll go over some of the statewide regulations, and we're not going to dive into all of them. We're just going to highlight a few of the really important kind of goose and waterfowl specific regulations. But all these regulations are housed in the Illinois Digest of Hunting and Trapping Regulations. If you've been waterfowl hunting in Illinois for several years, You may remember that prior to last year, there was an entirely separate digest for waterfowl. So you kind of had your deer, turkey, small game and upland digest, and then you had a whole separate publication that was waterfowl. They have since combined them, so they're all in this one document, which I find makes it a lot easier rather than having to deal with two all the time. But I personally recommend putting it on your phone, especially for waterfowl, because the bag limits change. They don't always change seasonally, but they can change seasonally. And so I never rely on kind of what I remember in terms of bag limits for waterfowl. I always like to try and confirm it. And so just having this stored on your phone is a great way to do that. But we really want to highlight this conservation order on light geese, as it's kind of upcoming right now in some areas, and in some areas it's already open. So this is, as Curtis brought up earlier, the snow geese have just this overwhelming population growth in the past few decades, to the point where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided we need to basically do something, and so their path forward was to develop this new conservation order. The interesting thing about this specific season is you can notice here on the far right side, a lot of the typical hunting and waterfowl regulations are relaxed. And again, that's because they just want to try to get as much harvest as they possibly can to reduce this population to a more sustainable and manageable level. And so some of the big things you'll know that changed during this specific season is you can now use unplugged shotguns. So typically during your standard hunting efforts, you're only allowed to hold 3 shells in your shotgun. Even if it can hold more, but you only have 3 in there, technically you are in violation of that law. And so you are required to put a plug inside the magazine tube of that shotgun if it does hold more than 3 shells. During this conservation order, that is removed, and you can put as many shotgun shells in there as you can. Electronic collars can also be used during this conservation order. During regular duck and goose season, you cannot use electronic collars. You must use air-blown calls, but during the season, you can use electronic collars. So that can be as simple as using your iPhone or your Android and connecting it to a Bluetooth speaker and kind of broadcasting these vocalizations. There's a lot of people that do that during this conservation order. As you'll note, the federal duck stamp is also not required. I still recommend purchasing it because, again, it's a great boon to wildlife conservation and specifically wetland management in this country, but it is not required for this season. However, in Illinois, state-specific duck stamp and hunting license is still required for that conservation order season. So now we'll quickly go over bag limits and possession limits. So bag limit is the maximum number of a given species that you can harvest in a single day. The possession limit is the maximum number of a given species you can have in your possession. So basically in your freezer. And the way that it's written in the Wildlife Code, the current legislation, is that possession ends when the animal is consumed, when the edible parts of the animal are consumed and the remaining parts are discarded. So if you have, let's go to the next slide real quick, Jason. Yep, so 3 times the daily bag limit by species and sex. So if you're over that possession limit, or you're at that possession limit and you want to go hunting again, you need to go ahead and consume some of that meat that is in your freezer before you can increase your possession limit again. So here's a quick overview of some of the goose bag limits. And so you'll notice Canada geese is 3 with the possession limit of 9. And so that is for the kind of the major duck season again, or the major goose season. Again, there is kind of an early season that Curtis mentioned earlier that's kind of targeted at that resident goose population. That bag limit, depending on the zone you're in, is 5. So you can see in that zone, kind of the north zone, so the northern half of Chicago, is 5 birds per day during that early goose season. That's, again, trying to reduce that population, similar to the conservation order, just kind of scaled down. But here during the regular duck and goose season, when we're hunting migrant geese, occasionally you'll still get some residents mixed in there, but that bag limit is 3, and the possession limit is 9. Now for snow, blue, and Ross's geese, so your light geese, Your daily bag limit is 20, where your possession limit is unlimited. The brant, which Curtis mentioned, is a very rare is a very rare goose in Illinois. You can only harvest one per day, but you can have 3 in your possession. And if you are able to harvest 1 per day, you're kind of the cream of the crop. Not many people get to say they harvest a brant, particularly in Illinois. Up next is the white-fronted geese, or the speckle belly. So you can harvest 2 of those per day with a possession limit of 6. A little bit about ammunition and legal firearms. I mentioned earlier about the concept of a plug, and this is where it really applies. But overall, you can use a shotgun that is between the gauges of 10 and 20. So that includes a 10 gauge, a 12 gauge, a 16 gauge, or a 20 gauge. You'll notice that 28 gauge and a 410 are not legal to use for goose hunting. Shotguns must only hold a maximum of 3 shells. So if your shotgun happens to be able to hold more than 3 shells, which the majority of them do, if they're a pump action or a semi-automatic, you will need to install a plug, which you can see here in this picture is kind of that green plastic piece that just kind of fits into the magazine tube and essentially takes up space so that more shells can't be pushed in there. Non-toxic shot is required, and there is a list of approved metals by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that are required. The most common is going to be steel shot. Steel shot is fairly comparable to lead. There are some distinctions that we'll get into a little bit later, but in terms of price, it is by far the cheapest of the non-toxic that's typically available. There's a lot more kind of fancy alloys in these things that perform better than steel to some extent, but they're a lot more expensive. Sometimes for goose loads, you could be looking at $35 for a box of shells, where steel, you maybe can get a box of steel shot for about $8 to $10. So there is a substantial price difference. So most people kind of choose steel. That's kind of the go-to for that non-toxic shot requirement. And that goes down to as far as do not even have a lead shotgun shell in your pocket, in your bag. Technically, you are in violation if you do have a lead shotgun shell on your person while you're waterfowl hunting. So just kind of make sure to keep those separate. And a really good way to kind of do that, because especially the way shotgun shells kind of wear, it might start to wear off some of the codes and words that are on the side of the shell. So I actually keep a very small magnet in my waterfowl bag that I can just quickly check, is it steel? Okay, because obviously steel is magnetic, lead is not. And so that gives you a really quick indication of whether it's a steel shot or lead. And if you do encounter a conservation police officer or a CPO while you are out waterfowl hunting, those are the 2 first things they're going to check. They're going to check to make sure you have a plug in your shotgun, and they're also going to check to make sure your shotgun shells are non-toxic. So those will be kind of the 2 first things. And then right after that, they'll ask you for your kind of required credentials, which for goose hunting in Illinois is going to be a standard hunting license, HIP registration, which stands for the Harvest Information Program, which is a free credential that is basically just added onto your license at the end of checkout. What I have found to be a little bit challenging with the HIP registration is if you go to like a Walmart or some of these stores who may have a cashier who's not really familiar with hunting and with the license buying system, very oftentimes they may not actually add the HIP registration on your license. So make sure if you do buy it kind of physically in person that when you purchase it and you get it printed out, look over it and make sure it has all of the things you need. So again, just to reiterate, you'll need a base hunting license, a state habitat waterfowl stamp, which is not a physical stamp. It's just something, again, that's added onto your license. You'll need that HIP registration, and then you'll need the federal migratory duck stamp, which you can buy, again, like Curtis mentioned, at post offices, at sporting goods stores, at national wildlife refuges, or you can now buy them online. Now, after the hunt, there are a few key things to keep in mind. There is a regulation called the Species Identification Requirement. And this essentially means that as you're transporting your harvested game home, it must have at least the head or one fully feathered wing must remain attached to that carcass while you're transporting it to your house from your field. And again, that's just so that if a conservation officer happens to stop you and check you, they can still confirm, what species it is, and be able to make sure you're still within those legal bag limits. I also do want to highlight, this is a good place to highlight, but if you do want to transfer waterfowl to another person, so let's say maybe you're your possession limit and you want to give some harvested geese or ducks to a friend to cook up and eat, there are a few things you need to do. So you'll have to have a signed tag and invoice of species, sex, and numbers that you're transferring them to that specific person. If you do have more questions about that, there's a pretty good webpage on DNR's website under the waterfowl hunting section that goes over that more in depth, but that's just kind of a quick overview. A few other notable regulations. We already kind of hinted at electronic calls are prohibited outside of that light goose conservation order. Now, if you're hunting light goose during the regular goose season, you still cannot use electronic callers. It's only during that period that's defined as the conservation order. Do not hold permit or harvested game for other people. And we actually sat down with a conservation police officer a few weeks ago, and one of the most common regulations that he noticed that waterfowl hunters kind of get cited for lack of a better term, is they don't typically have separate bag limits. So you can kind of think of it as if you're into fishing, you can't just all throw your crappie all into the same live well. You have to be able to identify these are mine and those are his. And what's very common with waterfowl hunters is just kind of, put them in a pile in the blind or just kind of hang them on the blind. But you need to make sure that you have separate bag limits and that they're easily discernible. So just kind of keep that in mind. Also, don't hunt areas without the proper licenses. Don't bait wildlife. But you can hunt over agriculture. And so the way baiting is defined is basically if it's legal, if it's considered a standard agricultural practice. So if you're hunting a harvested cornfield, that's a standard ag practice. Now, if you're hunting a field where somebody went out and dumped, 50 pounds of corn, that's not a standard ag practice and you would be considered baiting. So that's kind of that delineation there. Another thing we like to highlight is the tip line, which is the Target Illinois Poachers. And this is a great resource because there's a lot more hunters out in the field than there are conservation officers. So there's under 100 conservation officers for the entire state. And so a lot of times they rely on our eyes in the field to report things that we see. And so if you happen to see a poaching violation or some other wildlife violation, you can call this tip line. It's completely anonymous. If you want it to be, they'll kind of ask at the beginning if you want it anonymous or not. So that is there if you happen to witness any of these actions. But now we're going to dive kind of where we're going to spend the rest of this presentation is going over equipment, and then we're going to wrap up with some real basic hunting scenarios, and we're going to talk about what your typical hunt is going to look like when you're goose hunting and some common mistakes that people make and some other tips. But we're going to go through equipment really quickly. So I'm going to turn it over to Adam, and he's going to quickly go over equipment, and I might jump in a little bit too, as well as Curtis, just to kind of give our opinion on some of these things as well. So take it away, Adam.
Thank you, Dan. So like Dan said, we're going to talk about equipment. So first off, we're going to go over some ammunition and gun definitions here. So some things to remember. Dan stressed this pretty well, but we're going to stress it again. You must use non-toxic shot for all waterfowl hunting. That is very important. So for goose hunting, shot size 2 through T will work well for goose. If you look here on the right, we have a nice shot size diagram. So if you guys can see shot size 2 through T, any of those, so 1 BB, double BB, so on till T will work great for geese. Moving on, so some gun specific measurements. So the definition of gauge is the number of round pellets that are the same diameter as the gun bore that can be produced from a pound of lead. Moving on to length. Length is just the length of the shell in inches. So if you, where the arrow is here, the cursor. So this is all listed on the box. I should have mentioned that first, but when you go to buy a box of ammunition, all of these will be listed on the front of the box So you guys will now know what those all mean. So the velocity is the speed at which the shot leaves the muzzle on average. So for example, these shells right here, 1550. So feet per second is the velocity on those. The weight is the ounces of shot in the shell, and the shot is the size of the pellets within the shell. So like we covered earlier, shot size number 2 through T would be great for goose hunting.
And I would just like to add, the reason we kind of highlight these numbers, it's really important when you pick a specific shotgun shell that it's going to perform the way you expect it to, particularly with goose hunting. They're a fairly large size bird. And so you want to make sure you have enough energy and efficiency with your firearm to make sure you have an effective shot. And we have a video on our YouTube channel. If you just go to YouTube and search for Illinois Learn to Hunt, we have a pretty lengthy video where we dive into each of these individual metrics and kind of talk about, how you can adjust them. And if you buy a shell that has higher velocity, well, there's going to be a trade-off there. At some point, you're going to lose probably ounces, so you're going to lose weight in that payload, and so there's this kind of fine balance there. And so if you're interested in learning more about picking the proper shotgun shell, check out that video on our YouTube channel. It can help kind of break these numbers down and talk about the trade-offs that different numbers may give your individual shot.
Yes, thanks for that explanation, Dan. So moving on to some firearm accessories. So a few basic things that you guys will need if you guys own the gun is a basic firearm cleaning kit. You're going to want to clean your gun after every hunt, especially if you're hunting in rain and snow. Of course, buying a shotgun is an investment that, you don't want it to break or rust. So if you're hunting in inclement weather, it's super important to clean and oil that gun so it doesn't get rusty on you. You're going to want your applicable choke tubes. So depending on what kind of hunting you're doing, you're going to be using those certain kinds of choke tubes for that kind of hunting. For example, for turkey hunting, you might want something a lot more full. For goose hunting, you probably want to have something a little bit more full as well, just so you guys can really knock down those birds. As Dan just mentioned, they are pretty tough and sometimes are hard to hit. So you do want a smaller group of shot to hit that bird. You want a choke tube wrench so you can easily take your choke tubes out. You're going to want a gun case. If you're waterfowl hunting, we do recommend getting a floating case just in case you drop your gun in water. It's going to float. And then, of course, you're going to want a gun sling so you can sling your gun over your shoulder or across your chest or something, so you could go hands-free for, if you have to pick up a bird or something of that nature, you don't have to fumble or hold your gun with one hand. So some goose hunting clothing. You're going to want to get some camo waders or boots. If you plan on hunting mostly in just fields, you might not need waders, but I do recommend getting at least a good durable pair of bibs, especially for those cold days. You're going to definitely want some extra layers and protection. And then again, if you're not getting waders, I would recommend some good rubber boots that'll keep your feet warm and dry throughout the hunt. Of course, camo coat, baseball hat or stocking cap, of course, your base insulated layers, camo gloves, and then face paint or mask. Some optional accessories. You might want to get a call lanyard if you have a bunch of calls, but again, if you're just starting, you could simply just throw a call or two in your pocket. That's one thing you don't have to buy right off the bat. Goose carrier lanyard, a hand muff, neck muff, shooting glasses, ear protection, and binoculars. Some other miscellaneous accessories. A wader repair kit, that would definitely be handy if you plan on hunting in a bunch of water. Of course, the last thing you want to do is have a leak and then have, one leg full of water, and, that might ruin your hunt and send you home early. A camp backpack to put all your gear in, a flashlight or headlamp, compass or GPS. Again, Jason mentioned earlier Onyx maps, most of that stuff you can get on your phone now, but it might always be helpful to have another unit just in case. Actual physical paper maps, first aid kit, and then of course water and snacks. So now moving on to decoy types. So first off, we're going to cover full body decoys. These are a pretty expensive option. They take up a lot of space, but they are nice because they are pretty realistic and they do add some movement in the wind. If you guys ever watch, YouTube hunting videos and you see all the professional goose hunters, they always roll around with a full trailer packed with these kinds of decoys. They invest a lot of time and money into these decoys, and it's so much so that they have to have a whole extra trailer just to put this in because it takes that many decoys sometimes for their spread. So again, these are kind of an investment. If you're just starting out, you might not want to look into these right away. It might be something down the road.
And just kind of a quick explanation of how expensive they can be. So a lot of these decoys are called flocked decoys, and so it's a method of attaching, flocking to the head, so they look very realistic. But oftentimes you may be spending, $120 to $150 for 4 decoys. So they, like Adam said, they can become very expensive very quickly. I personally don't use any of them.
Yes, I've never hunted over these, but yeah, so as Dan was saying, they're so realistic, almost it's like felt that they put on top of it, so they almost feel like, even when you pick them up, it almost feels like you're carrying a feathered bird. So there's a lot of detail, which is cool about these, but that is what makes them very pricey. So moving on, your shell decoys. The nice thing about these is that they are stackable. So they are a little bit less expensive than your full bodies. And they're kind of versatile because you can use them on a stand or just lay them down. As you can see, this front goose right here is just straight up on the ground. So you can kind of use them in 2 ways, and they do save a lot of space because of that stackable option. So, if you live in a smaller area or an apartment or something like that, they don't take up as much room. So that is an option for you guys. And they do still look fairly realistic and work very well.
Yeah, I use these pretty regularly when I'm goose hunting. These are kind of my go-to decoys. And like Adam mentioned, they're kind of stackable. So you can kind of turn the heads and remove them and they all stack nicely. And I'm able to fit about 18 of them into a decoy bag, which we'll show you in a little bit. And so that's a great way if you're hunting public land or maybe some of these private pieces that you might have to walk a little bit ways. It's nice to be able to get, 18 to even 24 decoys potentially in your bag on your back and just kind of hike with them. Where if you're using the full body decoys, that would be impossible. You would be carrying maybe 6 or 7 at a time if you're lucky and in shape.
Yep. So moving on, we have the silhouette decoys. These are pretty inexpensive and they take up very little space. They're pretty photorealistic. But a couple downsides is that they only work from certain angles. Of course, they are flat, so you can't lay them down like the stackable one or the shell ones. They're only 2D. You can only see them from 2 sides. So these might be nice to have just a few to add on the outskirts of your spread, just to look like you have more birds. But you can get away with using these, but again, it's just situational. You might get lucky, or they might bust you by just having those. Anything else you want to add to that, Dan?
No, that's great. Like you said, when I'm using silhouette decoys, I'm using them very sparingly, and like Adam mentioned, I'm using them on the outside of my spread. They're a great tool to make your spread appear bigger, but you don't want these to be anywhere near kind of the landing zone where you expect the birds to come in and try to land. If they're near the landing zone, that can cause some issues, just because again they're not 3-dimensional. They're just kind of a cardboard piece of goose. But
Yep. Sweet, thank you. So moving on, now we have windsock decoys. So these are super affordable. They add a lot of movement to your spread and they're super easy to store. Again, these are decoys that I would probably put on the outskirts of your spread. That you don't want them, you might not want them to be your main focus. But again, they can add a lot of volume to your spread if you put them out on the outskirts. And if you look at this picture down here of the snow goose sock decoys, guides and outfitters who have snow goose operations sometimes have spreads that are 2,000 to 3,000 birds large. And so they use these a lot on the outskirts just because they need that many decoys to call in and bring those big flocks down from the skies. So these are super affordable, and they're able to put out a bunch of them and make it look really realistic. And the birds respond pretty well to those. So another type is your spinning wing decoys or your kite decoys. These are more confidence boosters. You can throw them in your spread and they might make your spread look a little bit more realistic and add some movement and pizzazz. But again, these aren't not necessary. It might be something you look into later if you really get invested into waterfowl hunting. So up next is a decoy flag. These are pretty fun. I like using these a lot. They provide a lot of movement to your spread, and they're made to attract birds at a far distance. So you might be, waving the flag, and it basically makes it look like a bunch of geese are landing in a spot from a long ways away. So you might be on the flag, waving it back and forth while your, hunting partner or something might be giving some long calls to try to attract some flocks that are way up in the air or really far away, just to make them turn and look at your spread. So these are pretty fun, and they're a good time to wave around. So moving on to decoy bags now, you kind of have two main types. Here on the left, you have a bag that's designed to have a decoy in each slot. So they're kind of bulky, a lot more expensive, and they are super nice because they zip up nicely and have everything organized. But they're not, they don't dry that easy, and they're kind of a pain to carry on, frankly. And here on your right is just your plain old decoy bag, mesh. The decoys kind of get beat up in there, can get scratched up, but it's nice you don't have to worry about them like stinking up or getting moldy or anything like that. And it is less expensive. So those are your kind of two main options there.
And I will say before we move on to Goose Calls, just to kind of end off on decoys, it may seem like one of those things that's kind of overwhelming at first, but my recommendation is to start with maybe a dozen or 18, Canada Goose shell decoys, and you can get a lot of hunting activity and a lot of successful hunting with just that small pocket of decoys. And that's typically all I use, is a very small decoy spread. And if you're looking for decoys, we're starting to get to a point where it's really easy to find used decoys on the market. There's a lot of waterfowl hunters that are affluent and that like to purchase, new decoys every few years or even every year. And so it's very common to find good deals on decoys on Craigslist, on Facebook Marketplace, on some of these other, user published resell places. So kind of keep an eye out for those. And you'll also notice a lot of the bigger sporting goods stores like Bass Pro, Cabela's, Field and Stream, Shields, are all starting to kind of clear out their inventory a little bit. And so very, very often this time of year, you'll be able to find some pretty good deals on decoys as they're trying to again, just kind of get rid of that old stock, and then they'll refill it in the new year. But we'll move on to Goose Calls. And there's kind of two main types of calls. There's the short reed call and the flute call. The short reed call is the most preferred by the majority of goose hunters. The challenge with a short reed call is it's very difficult to use. It takes a certain amount of skill set because it does require, not only are you blowing air through it, but you also have to force back pressure into the call at the same time. And so there's a pretty steep learning curve for the short reed call, but you can make just about any goose vocalization with a short reed. It's just very difficult to use up front. What I recommend getting started is the flute call. It doesn't require any back pressure. And you can learn it, within a few hours of a good YouTube tutorial. Now, if you do look into some of these calling demonstrations, I will caution you, there's kind of two schools of thought for calling. And what you'll see a lot of times on the internet is competition calling. And if you watch some of those videos, you'll notice they don't really sound like a bird. Very commonly, they're trying to get as long of call as they can, as sustained, and they're getting very intricate, and it doesn't really sound much like a bird. So if you are looking into YouTube tutorials, I recommend looking at some of them that are kind of more hunting centric. Ducks Unlimited has a bunch of good ones on their YouTube channel, as well as Delta Waterfowl, and we'll link those both in the follow-up email that we send out in the next few days.
So moving on to blinds, of course, you got to hide pretty well if you're going to be waterfowl hunting. So we're going to move on to those. So this is your quote unquote cheap blinds. These kind of camo leaf blinds that you can find at Walmart that are like made out of fabric come in super handy. Of course, it's all situational. It depends on where you're waterfowl hunting. But they can come in really handy and just add that extra little protection or extra little cover that might just save the day that day. And of course, here on the right, we have a picture of our buddy here who's hunting, basically inside a hay bale almost. He just put some burlap up and covered it with some hay on the bottom and on top, and was still able to see through that. And of course, the geese didn't see. So cool little blind he made right there.
And I think that photo illustrates a really good point, Adam, is that oftentimes if you can use anything that's already naturally in that specific area, you're going to be able to blend in a lot more naturally. And so sometimes, using hay bales can be a very good common thing, or using some of the natural cover if you're in an area that has maybe a lot of phragmites, which is that really tall grass that you see kind of along the side of ditches and stuff. It's a wetland invasive, but that's another really good one to hide it. So trying to use a lot of the natural vegetation that's there can be very productive.
Yep, I definitely agree with that. That goes for any kind of hunting, frankly. I mean, always just pay attention to what you have around you, and throw an extra few sticks or a few branches or something that you have next to you to give you more cover, and that might help you in any hunting situation. So yeah, pay attention to that for sure. So up next is a layout blind. So basically you have, it's almost, you're laying flat on your back, and you get cover from whatever is around you. Again, you want to, cover some on your feet there around the layout blind. And when those flaps close, of course, that's camo. And you're kind of laying amongst the decoys that you have in your spread. And of course, when the geese or ducks come in, you're going to pop open, and you're going to have a nice shooting line to do through that. So I don't really have any experience. So Dan or Curtis, you guys might want to touch on layout blinds, but basically that is the general idea.
Yeah, and this is by far the most common way that people hunt geese, particularly if you're field hunting. It's, again, a great way to camouflage. In this specific image you can see here, it's actually a two-person layout blind. The majority of them on the market are going to be kind of a one-person layout blind, but they're really comfortable. They're a really nice way to just kind of blend in naturally to the ground. And from the air, it very commonly looks like it's just kind of a little hill or a little mound in the field, and geese don't really give it a second thought. But it is important to use some of the natural vegetation that's, again, there to help conceal that layout blind a little bit more. The camouflage will do some of that for you, but mixing it in with some of that natural vegetation, whether it's corn stalks or some grasses, that can be very productive. But just remember, if you are on public land, you cannot cut anything to use in kind of blind making. So just kind of find that natural stuff that's either on the ground or is just kind of spilled. And sometimes you can even bring stuff in. They do sell some, fake corn stalks that you can kind of sew to the outside of your layout blind. So that is an option too. But they're a really good way to conceal yourself. And it's a really good way to take a nap in the morning if there's not much action, because you're basically just kind of in an enclosed sleeping bag that's got a nice headrest and is fairly comfortable.
Awesome.
And I would like to echo everything Dan just said. I got to hunt in a layout blind last year with one of our friends, and I just want to point out that if you leave them out, you may leave them out overnight or whatever, just be aware that mice like them as well. So just heads up on that one. They will surprise you.
That's a good tip right there. So moving on to boat blinds. So these are kind of the most expensive way to hunt ducks and geese, frankly, but it's a pretty big investment. You obviously have to have a boat or a john boat. Some people even make their own kind of kayak or canoe blinds, which is, kind of cool if you have, if you're only hunting with one or two people. But basically, you build a blind structure and cover on an actual boat so you can motor into your spots. Of course, you're only going to use these if you're hunting open water. But it is an option. Again, this is sort of a bigger investment, you know, and maybe it's something that you and your buddies might want to build over the summer and kind of going on a project together if you guys are really serious about hunting open water geese and ducks, stuff like that. But it is an option. But obviously, there's a lot that goes into a boat blind.
And depending on the portion of the state, if if you're in kind of the central or western portion of the state, boat blinds can be really productive on the Mississippi River, and it can open up a lot of opportunity for you to get out in the field. So that's primarily why people go this route. Is it's kind of fun to hunt out of a boat. It's a neat experience, but also it opens up a lot more hunting opportunities than if you did not have a boat. I'll take this one, Adam, because this is one of my favorite ways to hunt waterfowl, but unfortunately, it's not very common. This is typically on private land or at some of these more high-end outfitters, but essentially they're going to bury. Some people will bury old septic tanks. Some will do old freight cars. Some will just kind of construct their own thing. But essentially, you can see it's pretty much buried all the way up to the surface of the water. And what that does is it really allows you to just get close to the action, get concealed. And very commonly, waterfowl hunters will have these set up with a little stove inside, maybe a propane heater, so they can cook some breakfast and make some coffee. Because that's one thing you'll learn the more you get out with other waterfowl hunters and the more you waterfowl hunt. It's a very social type of hunting. It's not like deer hunting where you're just sitting in your tree stand all day alone. Very commonly, you're doing this with other people. You don't really have to worry about what you smell like. You don't really have to worry about what you sound like until those birds are coming in. And so very commonly you'll just be kind of there hanging out, talking, laughing, eating breakfast, telling jokes. Then you'll see birds off in the distance, and that's kind of when you can get hunkered down and start to get a little bit quieter. And so this is a great option. Again, if you're on private land, this is mostly where you will see them. But I will give a quick warning for both this type of blind and the next one. Obviously, ear protection is always recommended when you're out hunting, but really commonly with the pit blind and the next type of blind that we cover, these enclosed blinds really make that sound really dangerous to your ears. So if you are hunting out of these two, particularly, please wear ear protection when you're hunting out of these two blind types. But up next we have the permanent or floating blind, and this is the type of blind you're likely going to see at a lot of Illinois DNR sites. They do look a lot better than this specific example, but they're going to be kind of a wooden constructed blind that just kind of sits there on the water or on the edge of the water. Typically, they're going to have a dog ramp kind of built in so the dog can come up if you're using a retrieval dog. But they're just a really nice way to hunt and a really kind of user-friendly way to hunt. You just show up, hunt that blind, and you're good to go. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Curtis, and he's going to give us some insight into waterfowl decoy strategies.
All right, so we learned about all kinds of different decoys that are out there. So let's talk about how we use them to get the geese in within range. So first of all, what are your considerations? So you found a field or wherever you found the geese are using it. You arrive onto that onto the scene. Find where you want to set up. You need to think about the wind and the sun are the primary things that should be in your mind. So where the sun is rising or setting, depending on what time of the day you're hunting. And you should know which way the wind's coming from. So obviously that could change throughout your hunt, and you should continue to monitor it and be prepared to move stuff around if you need to. But all birds are going to land and take off into the wind. So that gives them much more control. And the wind is really the waterfowl hunter's friend. If you're out there hunting and there's zero wind at all, you're going to find that to be really tough conditions. For one, your decoys are going to look very static and still and not lifelike. Two, it's going to be very hard for you to hide because any movement that is out there is going to be amplified. But three, those birds could land from any direction. So if you have a nice steady wind, you always know which way the birds are going to be coming from on their final approach, which is good. And the sun, I argue the sun is equally as important to the wind. Not only is the sun at your back going to make it easier for you to identify birds, which may not be as important in goose hunting as it is in duck hunting, but really the main thing is it's going to help you hide. If you've got the sun at your back and it's a sunny or partly sunny day creating shadows, and yeah, you're in one of those layout blinds, I mean, you can have action right in your face. Birds can land basically right on your blind, so it makes it much easier to hide if you've got that sun at your back. Definitely never want it at your face. Not only are you not going to know basically what you're shooting at, but it's going to be like a beacon shining on your blinds, and it's going to make it much tougher to get those birds to finish. You're going to think about the landing zone, which we're going to see here in the next pocket. Birds don't like to land right amongst other birds, and that's basically to eliminate collisions. So you always leave kind of an open pocket where you don't have decoys right where you want the birds to land. And we'll see that here in the next slide when we look at some of these decoy placement strategies. So this is in a field. This is going to be probably the most highly used, easiest. It's a basic U-shaped spread. So in this scenario, we've got the wind at our back, which is generally ideal. We're also going to go ahead and assume the sun is at our back. So this is an ideal scenario for us. So we've got two strings of geese basically coming up on either sides of our blinds and a giant hole in the middle where there's no decoys. This is the landing zone. So approaching birds are going to want to land amongst the decoys that they think are geese because that's where they feel the safe zone is, but they are gonna target on that landing zone because they don't want to land right amongst other decoys because, like I mentioned before, if those were live birds, just imagine if some were landing and some were taking off, it'd be a big traffic accident, collision type thing. So to avoid that, always give them a landing zone. But if you've got, if you can't get the wind at your back and you got a crosswind, this next decoy spread is very common to use. On the next slide here, we're going to call this a scattered spread, or some people will call this a family group spread. And you could do this with any type of wind direction. Also, if you're hunting and the wind direction is moving around, and so it's hard to really decide which way to set your decoys because you're getting a lot of differences in the wind. This family group spread can be a great realistic change-up. So it doesn't look like the common U-shaped spread everybody else has. You're just putting little family groups of geese all around. Again, you're always keeping a large landing zone that's right where you want to shoot, and make sure that's within shooting range. But this way gives you a little bit more flexibility if the wind direction changes. And like I said, it's also just a change up, looks a little bit different than the basic U-shaped spread. Now this next spread we're going to in the water. You could also think about this in the land, but this is, this is a U-shaped spread in the water. So it's the same as in the land. Basically, you've got two arms of your decoys coming out into the water. Again, make sure you maintain that landing zone. So you've got a place for the birds to land. And one thing, whether you're in a field or open water, sometimes distance can be difficult to judge. And probably I think the biggest reason why maybe new hunters miss a lot of waterfowl is maybe they're taking shots beyond what is effective range. And so one little tip is, if you do have a decoy spread like this, maybe you've got one decoy that's different. So maybe all these decoys out here are geese. Maybe you throw one duck decoy or one snow goose decoy or whatever it is. Put it out there about at the edge of your effective range, 35, 40 yards. And that can be a good visual clue to you. If birds are coming in, you can use that to say, oh, well, are they really within range or are they not? So putting one off decoy out there can be a good way to help with that. Another thing is, of course, looking at the bird and just kind of getting an idea of what should be in focus when they're in range. The eyes or the feet, some smaller feature of the bird like that. But using an actual decoy to help you orient yourself can help too. And we'll move on to this next water spread. So a J type spread, this is great for cutting off a whole channel like this is doing here. And this could also work with a crosswind because generally the birds will land before they get to these decoys. But again, it's just a little bit of a variation to the U-shaped spread that can also easily accommodate a crosswind as well as a wind that's at your back. Same idea, basically the line of birds going across the water, you can think of those as your blockers. The birds that are coming in, if the wind was coming from your left or coming from behind you, that line of birds, they're going to land before they get to that most of the time. So you'll want to have that landing zone right within range. And again, you can use that sort of off species to help you mark what is effective range. And with that, I will turn it over to Dan for a typical day of goose hunting, but we went ahead and omitted all of the naps. But other than that, this is goose hunting.
Yeah, thanks, Curtis. One of the most important aspects of goose hunting is scouting. And so we're going to take kind of this approach of a typical day of field goose hunting, but we're going to start off kind of, previously to that day hunt and go over scouting. Scouting is the most important aspect of any hunt, really. Without birds in the area, you can have as many decoys and calls as you want out there. But if the birds aren't actively utilizing an area or aren't actively flying over an area, chances of you bringing them in are pretty slim. And I apologize for the train noise in the background. We have a train going by right now. But one of the biggest things you can do as a goose hunter is to find roost ponds. And we heard Curtis talk about this during the ecology section a little bit, that these are essentially places where geese are going to tend to sleep from night to night. Geese will kind of use these places in the evening, and they'll typically leave them daily as they look for feeding fields. So once you kind of have that roost kind of pond or roost site identified, it can give you a really good indication of, okay, those geese are still active in the area. Because maybe you have a few days where you're not seeing many geese flying. You can always go back to that roost, and if there are still birds in the area, they're probably going to be roosting in that site. However, what I would highly recommend is avoid hunting over the roost. I know it can feel really intriguing to go sit over an area where there may be a couple hundred geese floating on a pond, but chances are if you hunt that roost, you're going to get one good morning or one good evening, whichever you decide to hunt, and that's about it. After that, that's enough pressure that it's going to push them off that roost site, and they'll either kind of carry on south, or they'll more likely just go to try to find a new roost location, and then you're kind of back to square one. So finding these roost sites are really, really important. And my first step when I'm trying to find roost sites is, honestly, I'll get on Google Earth and just kind of go to my county and just scroll around in some of the ag lands and look for maybe little ponds, creeks or rivers if they're a fairly decent size, and just really look for any body of water and just kind of start marking those on a map. But the nice thing about geese and birds in general, they're pretty easy to identify and to find because, again, they're flying. Now, I will say when I'm identifying roost and I'm going to watch that roost, I'm going to try to get, a quarter mile away from it and just try to watch and see where those birds go the moment they leave the roost. And I think a lot of people really focus on just trying to find the feeding side of things instead of focusing on the roost. But that can be really important because, it's really important to be able to, okay, they're coming from point A and they're going to point B. And having that kind of totality of information is really important. And I also want to highlight, a lot of people will kind of focus on the big flocks that they see in the sky. But I have found I've had more successful hunts finding the feeding fields that have kind of a slow trickle of birds over an entire morning. Instead of a field that just gets, 500 birds at one time, or maybe, a couple dozen land all at once, and that's kind of all you get. I really like to find the feeding areas where you may get, 5 or 6 birds in a flock, and they just kind of keep constantly coming. And so very often, instead of following the big flock that leaves some of the roosting sites, I might just try to find some of the smaller family group flocks and see where they're going, because oftentimes that can lead you to a really good feeding spot. Now, when you happen to find the field or the area that they're actively feeding in, try to be as careful as you can to first not spook them out of there, but also try to figure out exactly where in the field they're hunting. And many people are going to kind of refer to that as the X. So that's kind of, again, where you want your landing zone essentially to be set up, like we just covered in the decoy spreads. But I've had several goose hunts that, for whatever reason, maybe the field wasn't laying right and I couldn't get right on that X. Maybe I had to be, 200 yards or so off of that X. Well, very commonly that's far enough away that you're not going to get any action. You're just going to be sitting there and just watch dozens and dozens of geese come to this feeding area. And so try to get as close to where you saw them feeding the day before or even a couple days before. And that's going to give you kind of the best option. Also pay attention to incoming winter weather. I know Curtis just kind of covered a lot of the open water scenarios, but one of I think the easiest thing any hunter can do is kind of wait for good weather to waterfowl hunt. I personally like to find cold, kind of overcast days, and I've had a lot of really good success when everything else starts to freeze up. Remember, geese and other waterfowl, they like to be on open bodies of water. They don't like to land on ice. They don't like to loaf around on ice. And so if you can find that one piece of water that's still open, whether it's, some type of community pond that has maybe a fountain or something, they will still be kind of using that as a roost site. Or if you have a pond that they've been roosting in maybe for a few nights and then it kind of froze over, get out there and break the ice. And that can turn a really bad hunt into the hunt of a lifetime. Some of my best, both duck and goose hunts have been after breaking ice in the morning and kind of opening up that water and allowing the birds to then get back in the water. So that can be a really important step as well. But again, just try to find where they're roosting. And that's as simple as going to look for bodies of water or just trying to find flocks in the evening as they kind of go back to that roost site and then try to figure out where they're feeding. But now we'll dive kind of right into a typical day of field goose hunting. And this, we're going to basically highlight Canada goose hunting, but this is going to be fairly similar for all the different types of geese hunting that we've covered thus far. But you want to arrive plenty of time before legal shooting light. And this is where scouting can really come into play, because there's been fields that, birds aren't going to actively hit until maybe 10:30, 11 o'clock in the afternoon. And if you happen to, get out there at 4 a.m. and start setting up your decoys, you have a long time to wait. And so scouting can really provide that information of when can you expect these birds to be hitting this feeding area. But assuming they're hitting that feeding area fairly early in the morning, I want to arrive plenty of time before legal shooting light, which is 30 minutes before sunrise. So depending on the size of your decoy spread, how many decoys you have, how many people to help set up with, how many blinds you have set up with, it might take you a while to set up. So I typically like to be out there about an hour or so before legal shooting light to make sure I have time to get all the decoys set up, get my blind brushed in really well. As you can see here in this picture, we chose this picture for a fairly specific reason. And that's because you can still see some of the layout blind that this individual is using. But you can also see he started to use some of that natural vegetation that's already present at that site to then further camouflage himself in a little bit more. And we kind of refer to that as brushing in your blind, or in this case, brushing in yourself or your layout blind. And that goes very, very, very far. Now, the challenge is oftentimes you're doing this in the dark. So good headlamps and those things like we covered in the equipment section are kind of crucial here. But one thing I really like to highlight is, particularly if it's a new blind, it's going to have sort of a sheen to it. Just kind of the material they use to make these layout blinds oftentimes have a little bit of a glare or sheen to them. And so taking them out in a field like this and getting a good, nice kind of dirt or mud layer built out on that blind, it doesn't need to be very thick, just enough to kind of dull it down a little bit, can really help you conceal yourself even more. And another thing, when I first started goose and duck hunting, and I don't really know why I thought this, but I never really thought to think of what the blind looks like from the air. I just kind of looked at it as I kind of walked around, and okay, yeah, that's pretty well camouflaged, but you have to try to figure out what it looks like from above, where the birds are going to be coming from. And so just keep that in mind as you're brushing yourself in and setting up your decoys. What is this going to look like from the air? Not necessarily just from your human perspective, but what's it going to look like from up above? So very commonly, you'll first, the sun will start to rise, and you'll notice that first distant flock that you start to see. You'll kind of hear that first call of a goose pitch. You'll hear that bloop, and that's when you can start to get a little bit excited. At that point, that's when I'm going to start calling. I personally am of the belief, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but I'm of the belief less calling is more, particularly with waterfowl hunting. Remember, these are migratory birds, and so they've been called at. They've seen so many decoy spreads, so many other hunters as they're, coming down the migration flyway. And so oftentimes it's setting yourself apart from others. And at this point in the year, you'll hear a lot of waterfowlers use the term decoy shy or call shy. And that's, again, just because they've been educated at seeing other decoys and educated at hearing other calls. And so oftentimes being silent can really pay off. But when I first noticed that first distant flock, I'll start doing some calling just to, again, try to get their attention as they're off in the distance. And as they start to react, I personally like to pay a lot of attention to their body language. When they start hearing you call, they're going to change a little bit. They'll start to either turn their head so they can hear a little bit better, or they might start to vocalize back. And so just kind of watching their body language is going to be really advantageous for you. If they just kind of keep on going and they don't really stop, they don't change directions, that's when I'm going to try to call a little bit louder and a little more aggressive. Because at this stage in the game, when they're still, a couple hundred yards away off in the distance, all I'm trying to do with my call is to get their attention for 5 seconds. If I can get their attention for 5 seconds, hopefully they can then see my decoys or see my decoy flag, and that's what will bring them in. So again, the call, I just personally use it to just get their attention, get them to look in my direction, and then hopefully see the decoys and hopefully say, okay, this is an active feeding area. So once you start to see those birds kind of commit and start to turn your direction, put your call away. Now you can still call, but chances are the more you call, the more you're going to, again, educate them. They're very good at pinpointing exactly where a sound comes from. And so that can kind of give away your position. And also the more you call, the more likely you are to kind of make a bad note or a bad squeak that can, again, alert them that something's not right. So once they kind of start coming in, I'm going to put away my call. I'll use a decoy flag when they're still way off in the distance, trying to immediately get their attention. I'll just kind of, flap it up and down as much as I can to just, again, get some movement and just kind of catch their eye just for a few seconds. But when they really start approaching your setup and it looks like they're going to commit, put your call away and just kind of get ready for the incoming shot. Now, what I like to preach really heavily on that first flock, very commonly that first flock in the day, unless it's really early and just kind of right after legal shooting light, chances are they're probably going to see something that looks a little off. So if you can go to the next slide real quick, Jason. Yeah, so very commonly birds may kind of come in your direction and look like they're going to commit, look like they're going to land in your spread up, and then they're going to flare. And so that essentially means they saw something they didn't like, they heard something they didn't like, and they chose not to land here. And so they flared off and they're going elsewhere. So when that happens, I'm going to get up and try to figure out what caused them to flare. Sometimes it can be your specific layout blind isn't concealed enough. Sometimes it can be your decoy spreads. And so a lot of people, when they first start goose and duck hunting, they kind of set their spread and they just forget it. I'm out there tinkering. Every flock that comes in is teaching me more about those birds and where they want to land and where they're trying to land, and filling those gaps with decoys so maybe they don't land over there. And so I'm constantly shuffling decoys around and constantly adding more, vegetation to myself to help conceal me a little bit more. And so just because those birds didn't come into your spread, you don't have to view that as kind of an unsuccessful flock. You can learn a lot from those birds that kind of flared off. So again, adjust the decoys, check your blind concealment. If all that looked good and you still really can't figure out why they didn't commit, chances are it was probably due to your calling. So maybe if you were calling a lot on the next flock, don't call at all. And maybe if you weren't calling at all, maybe try some very calm hums or some very soft calling, just to kind of keep them interested a little bit, to keep them engaged and make that spread look a little more lifelike. But there's a few waterfowl hunting ethics that we like to cover and kind of close out today with. We want to be mindful of other waterfowl hunters. We're all out here trying to do the same thing, and that's hunt waterfowl and get that nice wholesome protein back to our houses so we can eat it. So just be mindful of other hunters who are out there. Try to maintain at least 250 to 300 yards between hunting groups. Excuse me, and never set up just downwind of another group. You also want to be mindful of other outdoor users. Obviously, this time of year, deer hunting is over. Upland hunting and some other huntings are starting to close across the state, so it's not as common. But you still want to be mindful of other outdoor users, as well as anglers and wildlife watchers who are out there as well. Also, you want to take high percentage shots. Like Curtis mentioned earlier, using a decoy at the kind of edge of your spread to kind of mark the cap of your effective range distance. That's a really great way to ensure that you're only taking high percentage shots. Also, please clean up your trash. You'll notice if you start going to some of these state-owned and state-managed duck blinds, they are just riddled with trash and shotgun shells. And please just take the few minutes it takes to pick up your spent shotgun shells and your trash from the day and take it out with you. So please clean up your trash. But now we're going to go over a couple quick illustrations that show how to process waterfowl after you harvest. So again, I want to reiterate the species identification requirement that we highlighted during the regulation section. As you're transporting your harvest of waterfowl home, you need to keep either a fully feathered wing or the fully feathered head attached to that carcass, so that if a CPO does check you, he or she can positively identify that bird, both its sex and gender. So there are several different ways to process waterfowl. You can either pluck it, which means plucking the entire bird. I'll go ahead and say that's a very messy process. Feathers are very light and tend to just kind of fly around, and it can make a pretty big mess. You can also skin the entire carcass. You can quarter it out, or you can breast it out. Now there are a few regulations that kind of cover processing of waterfowl. And one of the big ones is the wanton waste law. And this basically means that it's unlawful for any person having control over harvested migratory game birds to wantonly waste or destroy the usable meat of the game. Now, for migratory birds, the usable meat is defined as the breast meat. Now, if you go to other states, some states have started to change and are now requiring you to also take the back legs off of game birds and migratory birds. So just keep that in mind if you do go out of state. But I would recommend taking the legs anyway. There's a lot of really good meat on the back legs of ducks and geese, particularly Canada geese. I really prefer the back legs smoked. It almost tastes like a turkey leg. It's so good. The texture it's amazing. So definitely take the back legs of waterfowl. It's definitely worth it. So if you want to dry pluck, you can see how big of a mess this can really make, but all you basically need is patience and a good set of kitchen shears. I will say, when I first started plucking waterfowl as a kid, I kind of just stuck my hand, grabbed a big hand, and pull straight up, kind of like you're starting a lawnmower or a weed eater. But there's actually a much easier way to do, because birds have kind of evolved to have very thin skin. That's just kind of one of the evolutionary traits that birds have. So they have flight. And so doing it that way, where you're just kind of grabbing a bunch of feathers and yanking, is you're going to damage the skin. And basically the whole reason you want to pluck birds is so that you can retain that skin when you cook it. And so doing it that way just kind of defeats the entire purpose. So the best way to do is just to grab a big handful of feathers, and instead of pulling, just kind of rotate your wrist forward, and that's going to be enough pressure to pull those feathers out of the skin. And so that's kind of the best way to do it. And there's really not much more to say. You'll just have to sit there. Again, it's a time-consuming process getting all those birds off, but it is a rewarding process if you do want to cook a bird that specific way. And that's why when I'm out hunting, or after I harvest something, I like to sit down for a few minutes and think, how am I going to prepare this individual meal? Because that's going to tell me a lot about how I'm going to process it. If I want to just maybe deep fry some strips or something, I'm not going to spend the time plucking it. But maybe I get a beautiful male or female mallard and I want to cook an entire roast duck, then I'm probably going to spend the time to go ahead and pluck it so I can have that nice crispy skin that has some of that fat and flavor in there. But again, it really just depends on how you plan to prepare that meal. So just kind of be thinking of that as you're making this decision. But now we'll go over kind of some basics of field dressing. And the process of field dressing, for those who aren't familiar, is essentially just removing the internal organs from the inside of the carcass. And this does a couple things. The big one is it reduces any bacterial contamination from fecal matter, from the urinary tract, from the stomach. All of that gets removed. But another big thing it does is if you think about your own body, a lot of your body heat is trapped in your gut. And to ensure we have a nice wholesome, protein and wholesome yield from this harvest, getting that big source of heat away from the carcass and allowing that cold air to move in and ensure kind of rapid cooling of that meat, that's going to make the meat taste better. It's going to preserve it much better, and you're going to have a much more wholesome quality. And so that's when we say field dressing, that's kind of why we're doing it. But the first step, and this is what's really nice about waterfowl, is that actually birds in general, like I mentioned earlier, they have really thin skin. And so the most time you don't even need a pocket knife or anything to do this process. You can tear the skin really easily. But basically all you're going to do is either make an incision or tear the skin and just kind of reach all the way into the chest cavity and pull the guts right out of the carcass. It's kind of that simple. Now, if you want to remove the breasts, so this is kind of my preferred way to do Canada geese, is I'm going to remove the breasts, I'm going to remove the wings, and I'm going to remove the back legs. But I like to start with the breast because it's kind of the biggest chunk of meat, and it's fairly easy to do. So you can either pluck the breast, kind of like you see here, or you can just go ahead and leave all the feathers on and just kind of make an incision through the skin. I personally like to keep the skin on the breast. It allows for a little bit more flavor, particularly if you can get a nice quick sear on that skin and get that nice crispy sear, and then you can throw it into a crock pot or cook it however you want to after that. But getting that skin nice and crispy adds a lot of flavor because there's a lot of fat and other things in that skin that provides a nice flavor to the meat. But then you'll just make an incision right along the sternum. So as you're feeling that breast, you'll kind of feel that sternum and that chest bone right there. And you can just kind of take your knife and make an incision along one side of it. And then at that point, that's when I like to peel apart the skin. Again, if you're going to take the skin off, if you're going to leave the skin on, you wouldn't do this step here. But for your first few, it does allow you to see the meat a little bit easier and allows you to have a little bit more flexibility. And I want to highlight, a lot of people are kind of not scared, but this process is intimidating to a lot of new hunters or people who've just never processed birds before. But what I want to remind you is you're not going to really damage the meat. You may not get the meat off in the prettiest looking, breast fillet ever, but as long as you get that meat off and, stored properly, you're going to have a good wholesome meal out of it. So don't be afraid to just kind of get in there and get your hands dirty. But after that, it's really just as simple as taking your knife right along the sternum and just kind of working all the way down towards the bottom of the sternum. So you can start at the top and run down to the bottom. And you can take that knife pretty much as deep as you want, because eventually you're going to hit the rib cages. And once you hit those ribs, that's kind of as far as you can go down. And then you'll just kind of start, cutting right to the side. And I know it's hard to show this in a picture. We're doing the best we can. Let's see what this next picture. And so here you can see kind of those ribs right along that sternum. And so once you hit those ribs, you can kind of follow right along with the knife. And you can see this individual is actually using a fillet knife, and that a fishing fillet knife, and that's what I prefer to use for geese as well, just because they're a bigger bird. But the flexibility of a fillet knife really allows you to follow the contour of that sternum as well as the contour of that rib cage. As you can see, it kind of flares out towards the bottom. So having that nice flexible blade can really just allow you to kind of run right alongside those ribs and pull out that entire breast. And so there will be a little meat left kind of attached on the side of the wing bone. And once you get to this stage, it's really just as simple as kind of trying to pull the breast out and see where it's still attached to the carcass, and then just kind of going in and cutting any connective tissue or any little bits of meat that may still be kind of still connected to the carcass itself. And that's kind of what you're left with. So once you get one side done, you can move on to the other side. And excuse me, I will kind of caution you, if you've never hunted waterfowl before and you've never really used steel shot before, maybe you've hunted pheasants or quail or dove, and maybe you've eaten some lead shot and you've bitten down on a BB of lead. It probably wasn't the best experience, but I will tell you right now, there's nothing worse than biting down on a BB of steel. Steel's a lot harder of a metal than lead is, and it's a great way to chip a tooth. So after this, I'm going to sit there and kind of extensively search for any BBs that are inside of that breast meat, so I can remove those now rather than bite down on them later and then have a fairly expensive dental trip. So some people do use metal detectors and big magnets to see if there's any BBs that are kind of still retained in that meat. But I find just kind of feeling it with your fingers, very oftentimes you can get either the vast majority or all of them out of that meat. But you definitely want to try to get those out as quick as possible, because those are definitely not good to bite down on. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason, and he's going to help us close out. Don't know if Jason's having audio issues, but these are kind of some of my two favorite recipes here for waterfowl and for geese specifically. A lot of people do kind of goose jalapeno poppers. That's a great way to get a bunch of people a taste of goose. So it's a really good party pleaser if you're having a New Year's party or something. Obviously after COVID or pre-COVID, I would cook goose jalapeno poppers a lot for different parties and get-togethers, because it's a great way to get a lot of people trying wild game for the first time in kind of a non-intimidating way. Jalapeno poppers, most people have tried those before and have some kind of desire to eat them, and so just sneaking in some wild game is a really good way to kind of take that to the next step. Goose also makes really, really, really good stir fry. I use a lot of goose for stir fry, both Canada as well as some of the light geese. I like to use snow goose if I happen to harvest a few of those. Those do really well in different stir fry recipes and things like that. But a lot of people who do a lot of goose hunting will turn them into like snack sticks or some different types of summer sausage products. Those are very favorable of a lot of goose hunters. We have a few upcoming webinars that we'd like to highlight. If you're interested in turkey hunting, turkey season is going to be here before you know it. It's hard to believe it's almost the end of January already, but turkey season is kind of just around the corner. So we do have a couple upcoming webinars to help get you prepped for turkey season. So next week we have Turkey Hunting 101 on Tuesday, and a nice follow-up that's Turkey 102 on Thursday. So that's going to be, kind of an introductory turkey course, and then we'll kind of take the next step and use a lot of the information we discuss in 101 and 102 to kind of apply it to hunting scenarios. So if you're interested in turkey hunting and you haven't signed up for those, please do so. We also have a new kind of virtual lunch that we're going to try in early February. It's basically going to be a utilization of wild game. So we're going to talk about using different parts of harvested game that may not typically be used, whether it's making fishing lures, making decor, some taxidermy products that we're going to highlight. Adam's going to show us how to make a turkey wing bone call. And so there's a lot of different things that we're going to highlight that are kind of non-traditional uses of wild game, and so that should be a fun one. And we're also going to highlight some of our favorite recipes and show some of us cooking some of those and kind of hope to inspire a little bit and try to just create some more engagement. Another note, we'll have our full February schedule probably released next week, and so if you're interested in taking other future webinars, feel free to either sign up to our newsletter, follow us on Facebook or Instagram, and we'll kind of post all those updates as we kind of progress. So here's kind of a quick link to all of our social media channels. Our YouTube channel is starting to grow, and we're going to start adding a lot more content to there in the next few weeks and months as we progress. So be on the lookout for that. We're going to do a lot of how-to and kind of tutorial style videos. So we hope that's a good resource for you as either a new hunter or maybe even a long-time hunter. And if you're new to the Illinois Learn to Hunt program, obviously with the current pandemic, we were forced to switch a lot of our offerings to kind of virtual. But if you're new to the Learn to Hunt program, we specialize in hosting these hands-on kind of field activity workshops, and hopefully we'll be able to get back to those at some point in the near future as the vaccine starts to kind of take hold and restrictions are starting to be eased. So just kind of stay on the lookout to all of our communication channels, and we'll hopefully be able to get back into these field workshops and some more organized mentored hunts in the coming weeks. But with that, we have a few minutes. So if you have any other questions, I know this went a little bit longer than was supposed to, about 40 minutes. But we hope you guys learned something and took something away from that. And we appreciate you joining us tonight. And hopefully we'll see you in the field at some point soon. Oh, look like we did have a question from Mark that Adam kind of highlighted and answered in the chat, but I'll go ahead and answer it out here too. So like turkey shotgun and aiming at the head, with geese, you are aiming at what? So typically you want to try to get as much of that pattern in the head of that bird as possible. With geese, it's a little bit easier because they have a fairly long neck. But I will say, if it's your first time shooting at geese, they are one of the, in my opinion, the most challenging bird to judge distance. Because you see geese all the time, whether it's in the parking lot, but when they're flying and they're right on top of you, they look like pterodactyls up there, and so it's really hard to gauge distance, and so that can be real challenging. But ideally, again, you want them coming to try to land, and so as they're kind of dropping into your decoy spread, there's going to be a point at which they almost kind of hover in the ground, because their gravity and their aerial speed is pulling them down to the ground, but they're going to flap their wings to kind of slow their trajectory so they have a nice soft landing. And that's kind of the ideal time to take a shot at a goose, is when he's kind of in that hover stage where they almost just kind of pause in free fall for a few seconds, and it gives you a really good chance to hone in on just that, the portion of the head and neck. But with that, I think that we don't have any other. Oh, we do have one more question. Oh, nope, just a comment. Thanks, guys. Awesome webinar. Thanks. And again, we'll go ahead and close it out. Just kind of stay tuned to your email, and we'll send out a recording of this, a few other documents we think you'll find interesting, as well as the PowerPoint slides. So just be on the lookout for that in the coming days. It'll probably be Monday by the time we get that out to you, because it'll take us a while to process the recording and that sort of thing. We have a question. Would you consider a session just on white-fronted geese? I find them tough to hunt when not on the X. Any specialist on specs. Yeah, I think that'd be a really great webinar. If people are interested in that, I think that would certainly be something that I would love to put that together. So certainly, thanks for the idea. All right. Well, thanks everybody, and have a wonderful evening.